Hello and welcome to Professor Moose, where I answer your questions about code and everything related to code. Today we have a question about the setTimeout function. Let's read it. Dear Professor Moose, I heard that if I use setTimeout, my callback won't always execute at the time I specify. Is this true? If so, why? Best, waiting for a callback. What a great question, waiting for a callback. You actually heard right. The setTimeout function only allows us to specify a minimum wait time, and our callbacks may actually execute later than we intend. They will never execute early, but they may execute late. So let me demonstrate with some demo code here. So I have a CodePen environment here where I can actually write some code and run it, and you'll see the output on the right hand side here. So let's first use setTimeout in the normal fashion. So I'm going to do setTimeout and give it a callback function, and inside here I'm just going to run console log done, and let's execute this timeout in half a second. So I'm going to run that with half a second, and it prints done, and that's what setTimeout is supposed to do. In order to see what might happen with setTimeout, I'm actually going to add some extra code here using the date.now function, which returns the number of milliseconds elapsed since 1970. And I can use this to measure time elapsed in milliseconds just by doing date.now again in the callback minus start. So this is going to print a number that should be pretty close to 500, which is the amount of time that's going to execute elapse between this line executing and this line. So let's run that code and see what comes up. And first of all, you're going to notice that that wasn't exactly 500 milliseconds. So that was 505 milliseconds, and every time I run this code, I'm going to get something slightly different. So this one was a little bit closer. That was 501 milliseconds, but it's not always guaranteed to be exactly 500. And in fact, it can get a lot worse. So if I were to add some code here, I'm just going to write a while loop that I'm deliberately writing for it to be slow. So I'm going to make this while loop use date.now minus start and compare that to, let's say, 2000. So this while loop is just going to keep running without doing anything for at least 2000 milliseconds, always checking if 2000 milliseconds have passed, and it's going to keep running till that happens. And this is going to just lock everything up for those 2000 milliseconds, and let's see what happens to the output of time elapsed. Is it going to be 500 milliseconds still? Is it going to be 2000 milliseconds, or is it going to be 2500 milliseconds? So let's check it out. I'm running it, still running, and it looks like it's pretty close to 2000 milliseconds. So somehow me adding code after the setTimeout, and this is not even happening before, right? Me adding code after the setTimeout that takes 2000 milliseconds to run delayed the setTimeout execution to 2000 milliseconds. So this is a good example of what might happen with setTimeout, where the timeout we're giving to the function is a minimum and by no means a definite guarantee of when our callback function is executed. And the reason for this is really JavaScript's single-threaded nature. In the language of JavaScript, only one piece of code can execute at a time, which computer scientists call single-threaded. And in order to be able to do things like running a timer without blocking all of JavaScript execution, the JavaScript engine in our browser has to coordinate with the rest of the browser in order to do that waiting. So when I call a function like setTimeout, what I'm doing is I'm passing this callback function that I've written to the browser, which will then start waiting for 500 milliseconds. And what happens when the 500 milliseconds are up is that the browser will try to pass that callback function back to JavaScript, which is why it's called a callback function. It's sort of like used to let me know something that I was waiting has happened. The problem is, because JavaScript can execute one thing at a time, if JavaScript is already busy doing something like running through this long running while loop, the callback function can't come back. So the browser is kind of stuck there twiddling his thumbs, waiting for JavaScript to be ready to accept my code. So only when this while loop finishes after 2000 milliseconds, i.e. 2 seconds, is the JavaScript engine going to be free to actually be able to execute my callback. And that's why I get my callback executed at around 2000 milliseconds elapsed, not 2500, because the timeout has run in parallel. It was just waiting for JavaScript to be free so that it can print my message. So there you go. That's why the execution time for setTimeout callbacks cannot be guaranteed. JavaScript is single-threaded and it can only run one piece of a code at a time. So when the timeout finishes and it comes back to the browser to execute, there is a possibility that something else is taking up the JavaScript engine's time and delaying the callback. In fact, a lot of JavaScript pieces of functionality like Ajax are implemented using async code exactly for this reason. We don't want async code to lock up the browser and stop JavaScript execution from happening while it's happening. So similar to setTimeout, the async callback in Ajax gets passed to the browser. Browser does the work of talking to the server that it needs to talk to, and only when the response is available is the JavaScript engine pass the callback back again. So this is a good, nice, simple overview of how JavaScript execution works. If you'd like to learn more about JavaScript's execution model in greater detail, I recommend that you check out this awesome talk by Philip Roberts, and I'll include this link in the description of this video too. And as always, thanks for watching. If you'd like to send me your questions for me to answer, email me at moose@professormoose.com. Thanks again. Goodbye.